Ghostrunner arrived late last year on PC and last-gen consoles. It's a first-person action platforming game reminiscent of Mirror's Edge, with fast, responsive platforming combined with simple but satisfying melee combat. On release, the game was particularly notable for its embrace of ray tracing features on PC, with RT reflections, shadows, and ambient occlusion. A few weeks ago it received a port for current-gen consoles, which promises ray tracing features as well as 120 FPS support. Today, we'll be taking a look at the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series S and X versions. How do these ports improve upon the last-gen iterations of the game, and how well have the new graphical features been executed? Ghostrunner is billed as a hardcore first-person perspective game, which feels very apt. It's a sort of action platformer with wall running, dashing, and slow motion dodging. Superficially, it's quite similar to Mirror's Edge, although the implementation of some of the traversal mechanics feels a bit closer to something like Titanfall. Somewhat unlike Mirror's Edge, however, most of the challenge in Ghostrunner comes from defeating enemies rather than landing difficult jumps. Most encounters are structured as a sort of combat puzzle, with the player expected to dash and dodge around enemy fire while taking out enemies and running around the environment. By default, the player takes just one hit to die, although restarts are mercifully quick. It's a refreshing and unique game that I have very much enjoyed. The white-knuckle platforming intense gameplay encounters feels very satisfying, and the game is challenging but fair. It really does play quite differently from anything else out there, despite some superficial similarities to other games. The game is set in the Dharma Tower, which is a densely architected futuristic Asian cityscape reminiscent of Hong Kong or Kowloon. This makes for a great excuse to fill the city with all kinds of cyberpunk artwork and motifs, which are executed well. This is a linear game with a relatively small scope, which has given the artists license to craft some interesting environments. Technically, we're looking at Unreal Engine 4 here, deployed very competently. The environments are detailed and we see a typical implementation of UE4 features, with good physically based materials, baked global illumination, and nice looking reflections. It's nothing extraordinary, but it's certainly a well put together visual package. The game has a nice suite of first person animations, which help to make the platforming feel very tight and satisfying. Unfortunately, the game lacks any form of motion blur on consoles, which is a bit of a shame. Some per-object blur would have made the animations connect and flow a lot better. Overall though, I feel like the game is generally successful, both gameplay-wise and with respect to its visual features and art. But how do these new versions stack up? Unfortunately, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Let's start with the basics. The PS5 and Xbox Series X each have 3 modes: a ray tracing mode, a performance 60 FPS mode, which can be enabled by running the game with ray tracing off at 60Hz output, and a performance 120 FPS mode. The ray tracing and performance 60 FPS modes both target 4K visuals at 60 frames per second, while the performance 120 FPS mode targets 120 frames per second at a reduced resolution. The Xbox Series S, however, has only one mode, corresponding roughly to the performance 60 FPS mode of other consoles. In other words, a higher resolution 60 FPS mode without ray tracing. The PS5 and Series X surprisingly turn in a native 4K presentation in most modes. The PS5's ray tracing mode appears to output a full 4K. In the performance 60 FPS mode, you get a flat 2160p output as well. The performance 120 FPS mode appears to come in at about 1296p, with dynamic resolution pushing it a bit above and below that figure at times. On Series X, the ray tracing and performance 60 FPS modes are native 4K, just like PS5. Finally, the performance 120 FPS mode seems to render at around 1296p, like the PS5 as well. On Series S, the Soul mode on offer appears to render at a static 1440p without any evidence of dynamic resolution. Outside of resolution and ray tracing, the games look identical. Ray tracing quality is also identical across Series X and PlayStation 5, and offers a nice upgrade over the screen space reflections and cube maps that are otherwise used. However, the actual use of ray tracing is a little limited throughout the game, as you only seem to get reflections on very reflective surfaces, and most of the materials used in the game are fairly rough. It's a nice upgrade, but not quite as impactful as the RT reflections in most other titles. It's also worth noting that the consoles don't get ray traced ambient occlusion or shadows, unlike the PC version, and the RT reflections are lower res than on PC. In general, the 60fps RT and performance modes on PS5 and Series X look very sharp and look great on a 4K set. The performance 120fps modes take the expected dive in image quality and look a bit soft but are still presentable. Finally, the Series S version acquits itself rather well with a 1440p internal resolution, which is solid considering the hardware. Unfortunately, performance is where things start to fall apart for Ghostrunner. Each console has its own issues. Let's start with the PS5. Both the performance 60fps and RT modes operate at a locked 60fps as far as I can tell. There are no performance issues with these modes and they feel great to play. The 120fps mode is great as well, and operates at a solid 120fps with just a handful of minor drops from time to time. There is a minor catch, however. Normally, when you try to play the game at 120fps, you get the exact same resolution and performance profile as the 60fps performance mode, which is 4K at 60fps. This occurs even with 120fps output enabled on both the PS5 and in the game settings. To actually enable 120fps, you have to go into the PS5 settings menu, go to Save Data and App/Game Settings, go to Game Presets, and toggle the default rendering mode to Performance mode. For whatever reason, this seems to enable the 120fps mode. It's a bit annoying, and I expect a lot of people who play the game will just assume the mode is broken. Still, once you have everything up and running, the 120fps mode works beautifully and feels super smooth. Now, Series X doesn't have the same configuration annoyances as PS5, but it has greater performance issues in-game. Firstly, the RT mode is pretty rough. The general output is in the 50fps range, and the game never feels good to play. It's well below the performance of the PS5 release in this mode. Thankfully, the 60fps performance mode is a quite consistent 60fps, although of course you do lose RT features in this mode. The 120fps mode on Series X is not very consistent, but still feels like a considerable step up from the 60fps modes. 120fps is in the cards in less busy scenes, but when the action heats up, the game can drop as low as about 90 frames per second. For the most part, I had trouble feeling these dips in regular play, and with VRR enabled, they are essentially a non-issue. Still, this is not quite as consistent as on PS5. The Series S is by far the worst console performance-wise. The game seems to render at a reasonably consistent 60fps, but the animation is highly inconsistent. Basically, in every second frame, the animation moves much more than in the prior frame, creating a massive amount of jitter and inconsistency despite maintaining a 60Hz update. This includes both camera movement and character animations. There are no configurable modes on Series S and no way to fix this animation issue, so this is a real shame. I did take a brief look at the last gen PS4 version as well. Here, the target is 1080p, but there's a form of dynamic resolution, with typical pixel counts in the 900p range, going as low as 792p or so at worst. You may see 1080p in less taxing shots, but typically the resolve is a fair bit lower. Given Ghostrunner is targeting 60fps, this isn't too surprising. However, performance is all over the place, typically hovering in the 40s and 50s and rarely actually hitting 60fps. It's in a bit of a frame rate no man's land. I would normally say this would be a good candidate for a 30fps cap, but the action in Ghostrunner is so fast-paced that I'm not sure this would have been a particularly good solution. Ghostrunner is a game that feels built for high frame rates with fast response, and the PS4 just doesn't seem up to the task. The last gen version helps to put the new consoles in context. The new premium consoles, PS5 and Series X, offer a huge increase in visual clarity and performance over the PS4 version. They also offer RT reflections, which are of course missing from the last gen versions of the game, but animation issues on the Series S make it tough to recommend at the moment, even compared to the PS4. As a final aside, the PS5 version has excellent DualSense support. The vibrations you feel when jumping and performing general movement feel very precise and add to the immersion. There's a pretty good use of haptics in the triggers as well that adds more tactility to sword slashes. This is a real standout feature and a great implementation of the DualSense that serves the game very well. So, to summarize, the PS5 looks great and runs very well in all modes, though it suffers from slight configuration annoyances. The Series X looks very similar to the PS5 version and runs similarly in the performance 60 FPS mode, but has poor performance in RT mode and somewhat inconsistent performance in the 120 FPS mode. And the Series S version runs well on paper with a consistent 60 FPS update, but it has odd animation issues which make the game look and feel much worse to play than it should. It's definitely a mixed bag. The PS5 and Series X versions are both pretty good versions of the game, although the Series X could use a bit of work in performance. Meanwhile, the Series S version just feels a bit broken, unfortunately. None of the versions feel perfectly polished, though the PS5 version comes closest. Hopefully, these issues can be fixed. Until then, Ghostrunner remains a fun and challenging title that is worth checking out, especially if you can experience it on one of the higher-end current-gen consoles. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell for notifications for new videos. To check out a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.